Imagine this, a nation built on the promise that if you work hard, if you save a little, and if you follow the rules, you can one day own a home. A place that is yours, a cornerstone of stability, a foundation for family, a pillar of the so-called American dream. And yet, in 2025, that dream feels less like a reality and more like an illusion, slipping further out of reach for millions of Americans. The truth is that housing in the United States has ceased to be just about shelter, family, or stability. It has become a battlefield of power, speculation, and politics. When we look closely, the housing market reveals something fundamental. It is not simply a reflection of supply and demand, or a matter of local zoning laws. It is, at its core, a reflection of who controls capital, who dictates the flow of credit, and who benefits from the structures of finance that govern everyday life. Across America, young people are discovering that the wages they earn no longer line up with the cost of owning even the smallest home. For decades, house prices have risen faster than incomes, driven not only by demand for housing, but also by speculation. In many major cities, homes are not being purchased to be lived in, but to be held as assets, tradable commodities in the portfolios of the wealthy. The American dream has been securitized, packaged, and sold to the highest bidder. We must also remember that housing is not evenly distributed across the United States. Some regions have seen astonishing booms fueled by tech wealth or global investment, while others have witnessed stagnation or even decay. This inequality of geography is mirrored by an inequality of class. For the working class and much of the middle class, the home is no longer attainable without decades of debt. Meanwhile, the investor class treats entire neighbourhoods as balance sheet entries, and it is here that politics comes into the frame. American housing policy, from tax breaks on mortgages to zoning laws that restrict density, often favours existing homeowners and established wealth. Subsidies flow disproportionately toward those who already own, while those trying to get onto the ladder face barriers at every step. Instead of being treated as a basic right, access to housing has become a privilege guarded by financial power and political influence. If we take an international perspective, we see echoes of the British crisis, where rising house prices became a substitute for wage growth and governments encouraged credit expansion rather than wage reform. America now follows a similar trajectory, but on an even larger scale. The question is not only whether people can afford homes, but whether a society can survive when one of its foundational promises has been hollowed out. Bonus section: the role of corporate banks and mega players. The most striking feature of the modern American housing market is the entry of institutional capital. No longer is it only individuals and families bidding for homes. Now, corporate banks, hedge funds, and private equity giants like Blackstone, Vanguard, and BlackRock hold vast portfolios of single-family homes. In some cities, entire neighbourhoods are controlled by corporate landlords who purchase in bulk, often outbidding ordinary families. This is not an accident, but the outcome of financialization. After the 2008 crisis, when millions of Americans lost their homes through foreclosure, large firms swept in and purchased these distressed properties at scale. What began as an emergency market intervention has now hardened into a permanent model. Homes are treated not as dwellings, but as rent-generating assets, feeding the quarterly earnings reports of corporations. The influence of megaplayers extends beyond ownership. Through mortgage markets, securitization, and financial derivatives, the largest banks shape the flow of credit, determining who can buy, who must rent, and at what cost. Federal institutions such as Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, originally created to expand access to mortgages, have themselves become entwined with Wall Street, often amplifying cycles of boom and bust. And so we are left with a paradox. The American dream of homeownership was once a story of individual achievement. Today, it is increasingly dictated by impersonal financial forces operating on a scale that individuals cannot compete with. The dream has been collectivized, not in the sense of shared ownership, but in the sense of being absorbed into the balance sheets of corporate giants. The question then is what comes next. If housing continues down this path, will Americans accept a permanent rentier society in which ownership is the preserve of a shrinking elite? Or will there be a political reckoning, a demand for reform, for public investment, for restrictions on corporate landlords, and for policies that recenter housing as a human need rather than a speculative asset? In Britain, we have lived through decades of failed housing policy and mounting inequality. Now, in America, the same forces are at work, but on a scale that could reshape not just housing, but democracy itself. Because when people lose the ability to secure something as fundamental as a home, they begin to question the legitimacy of the system that denies it to them. In my previous videos, we have examined the hidden mechanics of finance, debt, and global power. In future episodes, we will continue this exploration by asking what alternatives to this model might exist, whether new forms of ownership, public housing experiments, or even radical rethinks of property rights themselves could shift the balance. But the first step, as always, is to understand the problem in all its complexity and to recognize that the crisis of housing in America is, at its heart, a crisis of power.